Hello, today we're going to be looking at how the United States began to transition from the total war atmosphere that we were in during the Great War to returning back to kind of a more normal set of conditions. Um, the war effort did require a total mobilization. We had to mobilize our forces. We had to mobilize our economy. We had to shift production to try to increase enough ammunition and other weaponry for the war effort. Um, Prior to the war, we didn't have a full-time armament industry, so we weren't really ready to prepare for a war of that scale. We also had to make changes in terms, not only in terms of production, we had to think about producing food. And during the war, people were encouraged to, plant victory gardens so that they could reduce the demand on the food supply and grow their own food. And so many Americans did begin to do that. But when the war ended, then we had to shift back into more of a peacetime economy, and that brought several changes, and some of those changes brought problems. So, first of all, many men had left their jobs to go fight in the armed forces during the course of World War I. And so, as those men vacated their jobs, those positions had to be filled. Plus, we were continuing to crank up production for the war effort. Well, that meant that we had to fill not only the jobs that were left vacant by the men that had left to go fight in the war, but we also had to fill all of these new positions. And there were different groups that had filled those positions. For example, women. Many women entered the workforce during the course of the war. And many of these same women were pressured to leave those jobs when the war ended because, once again, the men returning home from the war were looking for jobs, and they were looking to settle in and adjust back to the normal life that they had before the war. But at the same time, we also had the Great Migration, where many African Americans left the South, where they had lived, in rural communities, mostly working as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and they moved to northern cities to take jobs. But at the end of the war, you have all of these soldiers returning home, and they're looking for jobs. And now a lot of their jobs were filled by African Americans that had moved north, as well as the fact that we had a large population of immigrants that had recently come to the country. And so there was a backlash really kind of against immigration. And in fact, this gave rise to a movement known as 100% Americanism, which celebrated all things that were American but rejected all things that were seen as being un-American. And that would include things that were associated with immigration or with the new immigrants. And this kind of becomes the basis of a great deal of racial tension in the United States at this point in time. And it also led us to see a resurgence of the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was started initially during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. And this was a period of time where the primary purpose of the KKK was to terrorize African Americans in the South and to terrorize supporters of the new pro-Republican governments in the South. And so, that was largely what the purpose of the KKK was. And it kind of died down a little bit after Reconstruction. There wasn't as much need for it. But, and, particularly because when Reconstruction ended, the Union troops were pulled out of the South, and there really wasn't as much protecting the African American vote. So, once again, African Americans went back to a situation where, although the 15th Amendment had granted the vote, they were oftentimes had to pay poll taxes or, had to pass literacy tests. Other means were used to discriminate and disenfranchise them. But ultimately, the KKK sees a resurgence in the 1920s. And this resurgence starts right after World War I, And at this point in time that the KKK kind of starts growing again, it began to infiltrate the Protestant churches in America. And they began to change their targets, as where during Reconstruction, the targets of the KKK were predominantly African Americans or those that supported African Americans. In this new era, the KKK began to target uh, any groups that they saw as being un-American. And particularly, they went after anybody who wasn't what you would consider to be a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And so they began to target many of the new immigrant groups. Many of the new immigrants were Catholics, so Catholics were frequently targeted. They targeted Jews, and they targeted basically any racial minority. And so during this time, we saw a big growth in that. Something else that also added to the general conditions or the anti-immigrant feeling in the United States was that at this particular time, we had many many of these immigrants worked in what we would call union type jobs, jobs that were, union labor. And, during the war, there was efforts made. The National War Labor Relations Board tried to settle disputes between management and labor so that production for the war could continue on. But with the end of the war, that began to change. And so, workers kind of lost that support, and there were many strikes that took place during the year 1919. Oftentimes, these strikes became violent, and as a result, many people blamed these foreign unionists, or particularly the immigrants. And so, and plus, many immigrants also belonged to various radical groups as well. And so these radical groups were also targeted during this period.